The way this all unfolded followed a pattern in Dick Cheney's life. Summing up his career a few years ago, he said, "A few breaks came my way, and one job always led to another, in a life that's taken me far to more places than I ever expected." That was Dick's typically understated version of events, but there's a little more to the story. His abilities were self-evident without need of calculation or self-promotion. His talent and restraint exceeded his ego. Even before the Cheney name reached the national stage, people always saw something in the man, solid, reliable, and rare. One of the first to really notice was Lynn Vincent. She can recall a time in their college years when Dick, as he freely admitted, lacked direction and needed some straightening out. I think we had that in common. That was Lynn's kind of project, and it did not take her long. He said many times that his life would have turned out a whole lot different if he had never met her. It may explain how in just over a decade, a guy can go from laying transmission lines outside Cheyenne to serving as chief of staff of the President of the United States. In Dick's telling, those years working for Gerald Ford were special and formative. He cherished the association, and the high regard went both ways. In his memoir, President Ford described Dick's steadiness, his low-key style, and his absolute loyalty. I know exactly what he meant. These are not traits easy to come by in Washington. Being calm, reticent, undramatic, and untrustworthy are not everyone's formula for success in politics. But they were the Cheney way, and they worked. I'm reminded of a renowned senator who once gave this advice to a junior colleague. Perhaps he said you could occasionally allow yourself the luxury of an unexpressed thought. Dick Cheney was like that, sparing and measured with words. In a profession that attracts talkers, he was a thinker and a listener. And when he did speak up, conveying thoughts in that even tone of voice, that orderly, unexcitable manner, you knew you were getting the best of a highly disciplined mind. No colleague, no legislator, no foreign leader who ever met Dick Cheney ever doubted that they were dealing with a serious man. Of course, not every political counselor is cut out to be a political candidate. But Dick Cheney put himself to the test and never lost an election. In fact, it happens that he and I both ran for Congress in 1978. And let me just say the Republican wave didn't reach West Texas that year. He told me a few times what it's like to campaign in Wyoming. Lots of small gatherings and long drives. It's easy to imagine the impression that young Dick Cheney made when he was asking for the vote. I wish more Americans got to know Dick Cheney the way the folks in Casper, Cody, and Laramie got to know him. Smart and polished, without airs. Courteous and approachable, seeing everyone as an equal, a gentleman by nature, and a true man of the West. Dick was funny and easygoing in a style that his public image never caught up with. Though we can all agree he wasn't your standard issue politician. If any voters came hoping for a kind word and a hug, they'd have to settle for the kind word. But you can't question the appeal of the only person from America's Mountain West ever elected to national office. On that score, history should record that I chose my vice president not once, but twice. In 2004, he offered to step aside in case I wanted to replace him. I thought about it for a while, but after 4 years of seeing how he treated people, how he carried responsibility, how he handled pressure and took the hits, I arrived back at the conclusion that they do not come any better than Dick Cheney. Colleagues from every chapter of his career will tell you that he lifted the standards of those around him just by being who he was, so focused and so capable. In our years in office together, on the quiet days and on the hardest ones, he was everything a president should expect in his second in command. In moments of testing, Dick Cheney was the model of concentration, alertness, and composure. His memoir was titled My Time. His time produced an old breed of public servant, defined by their substance and character. This was a vice president totally devoted to protecting the United States and its interests. There was never any agenda or angle beyond that. You did not know Dick Cheney unless you understood his greatest concerns and ambitions were for his country. Across 40 years, his service was consistent, faithful, and noble. All in all, not a bad showing for a career and a life, especially when you consider his sheer physical endurance. As Dr. Rayner pointed out, he became an authority on cardiovascular disease and a marvel at what resourceful doctors and one very determined patient can accomplish. Dick had faced down fears and hardships, but he really didn't speak about them. The reward was more of a life than he ever expected, including 7 grandchildren to complete the picture. One of them, Richard, even asked his grandfather to attend kindergarten class for a show and tell. I wish I'd have been there. As a matter of fact, the teacher told Dick that was the most exciting show and tell since the morning a little girl brought her cow to class. That might have been amongst Dick's last moments in the spotlight. In his final years, he was content to go his way. At a rare public appearance in 2022, he offered a kind of parting reflection. He said, when you can look back on a lifetime in politics and government, and what you value most are the friendships, then I guess you've done all right. A lot of us know that feeling as we say an affectionate farewell to the 46th Vice President of the United States. It's something to be cherished when a man of his caliber has been your colleague and friend. The son of Wyoming, son of Marjorie and Richard Cheney of Casper, went far in this world and in our own lives left a very fine mark. We are grateful for his good life, we honor his service, and we pray that somewhere up the trail we will meet him again.
Former President George W. Bush speaking at the National Cathedral about the life, and the legacy of his friend, his former Vice President Dick Cheney there. I'm joined now by Kelly O'Donnell, who covered the Bush-Cheney administration for years, and by our moderator of Meet the Press, Kristen Welker, as well. Kelly, you heard the former president there reflect on the many memories that he shared with Dick Cheney, who really lived a life of service, but leaves behind, too, a complicated legacy.
Many people will reflect on the complications and the criticism of Dick Cheney. And today, through these words, we're hearing about the kinds of things that represent a type of leadership that may seem quaint and out of date, and yet that is what former President Bush wanted to emphasize, that it was about accomplishment and intellect, not ambition, that it was about service but not the public face in the way that politics has evolved, where the cult of personality, where how someone is perceived publicly might drive their decisions. That was not true of Dick Cheney. He, of course, was a forceful vice president. He used that role to try to engage on policy and to lead and to give counsel without ever planning to seek the office himself. The reflections today tell us a lot about this man who was both gruff and kind and also very determined. And that is what probably history will read. Certainly his involvement in the War on Terror and in the Iraq War drew a lot of criticism. He had also been the CEO of Halliburton, and that drew criticism, being in the oil business. But he was also a person who today is reflected upon for some of the simple things. His cardiologist spoke of his being a determined patient. People forget he had a heart transplant and many, many heart incidents. That probably tempered some of the parts of his public life.
Kristen, in attendance at the cathedral is every living former vice president. We've seen them in some of the images coming to us from the cathedral, except for the current vice president, J.D. Vance. President Trump is not attending, was not invited. You heard former President Bush call Cheney one of the old breeds of public servant. He is also in so many ways part of the old guard of the Republican Party.
Hallie, absolutely right. These images that we are seeing, these extraordinary bipartisan images that you referenced to some extent, are a part of a bygone era of politics when you did have these moments of bipartisanship in a way that we don't see typically today. Dick Cheney represented that old guard in many ways, shaped the modern vice presidency. And his hawkish views of foreign policy, as Kelly is saying, some were critical, some were supportive, but they really laid the groundwork for a lot of what we are seeing now in our politics. President Trump running an America First foreign policy that was in sharp contrast to what we saw during the Bush-Cheney administration. And of course, we all remember that Cheney, the former vice president, came out and endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris. He was sharply critical of President Trump, and President Trump was critical of him. But again, on display, the divide that we now witness in the GOP.
Let's take you to the Washington National Cathedral, where our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander, is outside the building. And Peter, it is a who's who of notables from Washington to Wyoming and beyond.
I think that's exactly right, Hallie. Notably, a very bipartisan turnout here. You have Presidents George W. Bush and former President Joe Biden seated effectively side by side. Kamala Harris and Mike Pence seated next to one another as well. We heard notably from the former Vice President Mike Pence a short time ago saying that while this country is as divided as any time in his lifetime, he said what is notable is that most Americans are not nearly as divided. And I think that's demonstrated by some of those who are seated together today celebrating the life, the legacy, the service of Dick Cheney here. We heard from the former president under whom Dick Cheney served, President Bush, saying, among other things, that his greatest ambitions and concerns, those of Cheney, were always for his country, that it was always about country first. And in many ways, that's what divided him from the current president of the United States, who, as you noted, is not in attendance today. J.D. Vance also not invited to the ceremony, the memorial service being celebrated here today. The president, by law, taking the flags down to half-mast, but notably not delivering any comments or any consolation, any condolences to the family. And it does follow the really public split between Dick Cheney's daughter, Lynn Cheney, who was very upset by what she witnessed on January 6th that she blamed on President Trump in his first term. Dick Cheney ultimately being very public in his criticism as well, saying that never in his lifetime had he seen a greater threat to our republic. Hallie?
Peter Alexander in Washington for us there outside the cathedral. Peter, thank you. You are seeing the funeral service continue now, and we will have continuing coverage of it, including remarks coming up in just a moment from the former vice president's daughter, Liz Cheney. That's on our streaming station, NBC News Now, and online at NBCnews.com. For now, this concludes our special report. I'm Hallie Jackson. Thanks for watching.